Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 7 on USA conflict 1954 to 1975. And this video, ladies and gentlemen, brings to an end the first section. We've looked at black civil rights in the 1950s in this first section of the course. Now, as I've said there, we've looked at some examples of the civil rights movement beginning to make progress. For example, the Brown-Topeka case, the education. We looked at the Little Rock Nine. We looked at the Montgomery bus boycott. All examples of maybe steps forward towards blacks becoming more equal in America in the 1950s. This video, though, ladies and gentlemen, looks at the other side, because there were very huge numbers of people, particularly in the southern states, who did not want the civil rights movement to make progress. They opposed civil rights and they wanted to stop it. So it's this section that's of opposition to the civil rights that we're looking at in this video. Now the video, I'll divide it into 4 sections because there are 4 types of opposition. The first one, possibly the most famous group of all, sometimes known as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this was a group of people, and it stretched back almost 100 years to about 1865, when blacks got emancipation. In other words, the black slaves got their freedom in America. Well, they did not want blacks to become more equal. The KKK was particularly strong in the southern states because that's where slavery had been strongest. And for many years they used a variety of tactics: fear and terror, violence. They would burn crosses at night, and their most famous of all, and maybe their most awful of all, was they were involved in lynchings or hangings. More than 2,000 people were hanged from about 1865 onto the 1950s. Now, you may have seen pictures of them. They wore a white uniform, white robes, and they had a white hood on their head because it was a secretive association, a secretive group. They wanted to be anonymous, even though it's been proven later that particularly down in the deep south, many of the law enforcement officers, the police officers, either knew of members of the KKK or they themselves were members of the KKK or were certainly sympathetic to their views. So who would be in the KKK? Well, you may have heard of something called WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They formed the KKK. Now, who didn't they like? Well, their main hatred, their main target was black African Americans. But they also did not like, and therefore would attack, Jews, Catholics, people with a liberal approach, talking of equality, etc. So they were their main targets, and right at the top of their list was black Americans. And as the civil rights movement started to make progress in the 1950s, as we've seen, the membership of the KKK rose and their activity rose. There's a link there between the civil rights movement and a reaction from the Ku Klux Klan. They were the most famous opposition to civil rights, the first group. Now, I just mentioned there the word violence. Well, let's take that as our second area of opposition. Okay, violence was used against the black community. I'm going to talk briefly about 3 cases, all down in the state of Mississippi. Well, let's go to our map again. There's a map of America. Now, Mississippi is this state down here. And I've mentioned there, point number 4, a settlement, a small town called Money in the state of Mississippi. I'll come back to that later. So, 3 cases of extreme violence, all sadly resulted in the death of a person. These 3 people were murdered. Case number 1. A man called Lamar Smith, a civil rights activist. He wanted to encourage black people to register to vote. Now, he was shot in broad daylight. There were at least about 30 witnesses. 3 white people were arrested, taken to court, and they were not guilty, acquitted. And who acquitted them? An all-white jury. Because remember, down in the deep south, in states like Mississippi, black people would not be allowed on the jury. So that's the first case. Second case, a man called Reverend George Lee, another civil rights activist, again encouraging black people to register to vote. He was sat driving his car pulled up, car pulls up next to him, 3 shots are fired. The Reverend George Lee loses control of his car and the car crashes. The police investigate. Now remember, he's been shot 3 times. The police investigate and say, oh, there's been a road accident. Well, he's been shot. And when fragments of lead were found from the bullets, the police said, oh, that's probably fillings from his teeth. Can you see what's happening here, ladies and gentlemen? They don't want to get to the truth. No one was ever arrested for the killing of Reverend George Lee. And finally, the third case, possibly the most famous of all. Let's go back to point number 4, the town of Money in Mississippi. Because it was here, ladies and gentlemen, that a very, very severe case actually occurred. A young boy called Emmett Till, a 14-year-old, was visiting some family and his relatives coming down from Chicago in the state of Illinois. He was with his relatives outside a store, a local store. Now there's some controversy, there was some debate or dispute about what was actually said. The white woman who owned the store, a man called Carolyn Bryant, she said that Emmett Till, this 14-year-old black boy, touched her waist, asked her for a date, said, "Bye, baby," and wolf whistled at her. That sort of thing. Emmett Till's relatives said, no, that didn't happen. They admitted, yes, he did wolf whistle at her. So there's some debate there. The next night, Carolyn Bryant's husband and his half-brother went round to where Till was staying, Emmett Till. They abducted him, kidnapped him, took him away, beat him, shot him, put a weight around his neck and threw him into the river. 3 days later, his body was found. Now, what happened next? Emmett Till's mother, a woman called Mamie Brady, travels down from Chicago and took her son's body back to Chicago. But she left the coffin open when she returned, so loads and loads of people could come past and view the body and see what had happened to this 14-year-old boy. Many people saw it, and the publicity led to an outrage. People were shamed that this could happen in America, and it gave a boost to the civil rights movement. Back down in Money in Mississippi, Carolyn Bryant's husband and his half-brother went to trial. At the trial, which lasted 4 days, there was an all-white jury. The verdict? Well, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? You probably said not guilty, and you were probably right, because that was the verdict. In fact, the jury took 1 hour to come to their decision, And one member of the jury said, well, we'd have come to the decision quicker only we had a break for a few drinks. Again, outrage in parts of America, made worse by the fact that later the two men, Bryant and his half-brother, sold their story to a magazine for $3,500 and admitted the murder. More outrage. The NAACP produced a pamphlet, and it said, M is for Mississippi and murder. They were trying to use the publicity of the Emmett Till case to move their case forward. Can we see, therefore, that opposition and violent opposition was still very much part of the reaction to the civil rights movement in the 1950s? Now, the first two, I've looked at violent opposition. Often the Ku Klux Klan used violence, and we've just looked at 3 cases of murder. But there was other types of opposition as well. And the third and fourth group used political opposition to the civil rights. Now, the first one is the White Citizens Councils. I've mentioned them in some of the other previous videos. Set up after 1954, after the Brown versus Topeka Supreme Court case. Now, the White Citizens Councils wanted to keep segregation. They wanted to keep black and white separate in all forms of life, the Jim Crow laws. And they used rallies, protests. They wanted to stop black people registering to vote. They used economic means, and they called on people to, if they had black people working for them, to sack the black people if they were becoming involved in civil rights. Sometimes the white citizen councils also used violence and threats and intimidation. And in 1963, one of their members shot a civil rights activist, a man called Medgar Evans. I'll deal with him in a later video. And into the 1950s, because of the progress of the civil rights, thousands and thousands and thousands of members joined the White Citizens Councils. It's another type of opposition to what was happening in America because of the civil rights movement. The fourth and the final type of opposition. We move to the seat of power itself. In this country, ladies and gentlemen, when we have elections, we elect members of parliament, MPs. In America, they have 2 types of House of what we would call the House of Parliament, the House of Congress, and the House of the Senate. No, that's not right. It's House of Representatives and the Senate. Excellent. Sorry about that. And it's these political people, elected representatives, who also opposed civil rights, or some of them did. They were particularly strong in the southern states. In 1956, a group of them get together and write and agree to something called the Southern Manifesto, which basically opposed Brown versus Topeka. And they said, look, in the original United States Constitution, there's no mention of education. Therefore, the Supreme Court should not be talking about equality in education because it's not in the Constitution. They wanted to keep segregation. They wanted to go against the federal government. So they would be quite strong opposition because they're elected. They've got power. Linked in with this is a group called the Dixiecrats, Democrats in these southern states. Now, they were so incensed and really fired up by this idea of stopping segregation, they hated it, that briefly they set up their own party. But then they went back into the Democrat Party because they realized they could have more power there. And they, again, did not want segregation to happen. I remember I mentioned someone in a previous video called Strom Thurmond, and he spoke for over 24 hours to try to stop the Civil Rights Act. That shows the level of opposition that these people would go to. They had power. They had influence. Because even the President of America needed the support of these Dixiecrats, these Southern Democrats. So therefore the President would not necessarily be able to go against their views because he needed them to vote for him to get through other laws. Even later in 1960 to 1963, President Kennedy, JFK, who was quite liberal and wanted to maybe do something to help civil rights, when he was trying to be elected, he sort of played it down because he didn't want to upset these Dixiecrats. And because they had the power, they were able to challenge or slow down the Supreme Court decisions. Yes, they would say, right, well, we're obeying the Supreme Court in theory, but in practice, they would do everything to try and stop that. For example, segregated schools. Well, that had to stop according to the Supreme Court. But down in the southern states, what they would do is set up school tests, which were really, really difficult for some of the black people to pass. They were sort of biased against them. So then they say, oh, well, look, we've got the tests. If they pass the test, they can go to that school. But it was all set up to try and cheat the system. So we've seen there some groups of opposition. Some used violence, some used politics, some used economics, threatening people with losing their jobs. But it shows the key point that there was quite a lot of opposition to civil rights in the 1950s. Now, I just mentioned there school tests. Well, as we know, these videos are aimed to try and help you in your GCSE history. Seeing as we've come to the end of the first section, let's have a look at a sort of question that you might get asked. It's an inference question, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what is inference, I hear you ask? What is inference? Well done. Yes, I thought I heard it. Now, inference, what it really means is, what message can you get from looking at something, a piece of evidence, a photograph, a piece of writing? What message can you get by sort of like reading between the lines? What does it suggest to you? Well, what do I mean by that? Well, now let's say if you said, right, I'm going to go out later, Mr. O'Toole, but I don't know what the weather's like, I can't see out, and I haven't seen the weather forecast. And I say, okay then, if I were you, if when I'm going out, I'm going to wear these huge pair of sunglasses, what could you infer? What could you work out? Or imagine if you're going out and I said, oh, I tell you what, if I'm going out, I'm going to dress up like this. Oh, I'm going to put my hat on, my gloves on, my scarf on. Well, what would you infer the weather's like, ladies and gentlemen? Correct? You'd say either it's raining or it's very, very cold. And that's what inference is. You look at something, you look at some evidence, and you make a suggestion about what message you've got from that evidence. And they'll ask you that in your question 1 in your exam. Now, let's have a little go at that. Let's have a little example. One of my all-time heroes. Sing Muhammad, Muhammad Ali. He floats like a butterfly and stings like a bee. Now, Muhammad Ali, one of the greatest boxers ever, possibly the greatest boxer, maybe one of the greatest sportsmen of all time. Now, he actually wrote a book, an autobiography. Now, Muhammad Ali was never short of self-confidence, ladies and gentlemen, and he called his book The Greatest, My Own Story. Muhammad Ali. I'm going to read you a little bit from that book of Muhammad Ali's. He's talking about the murder of Emmett Till. And he'd seen photographs of Emmett Till alive as a normal 14-year-old boy, and then he saw a photograph of Emmett Till taken in his coffin after he had been murdered. And this is what he wrote. I felt a deep kinship to him when I learned Emmett Till was born the same year and the same day I was. My father talked about it at night. I couldn't get Emmett out of my mind. That's what he wrote in his book. Well, what could you infer? What inference could you make about Muhammad Ali and Emmett Till? What message? What suggestion? Well, you could say, number one, that the murder of Emmett Till had a huge impact on Ali. And you can use a sentence to prove it. I couldn't get Emmett out of my mind. Another inference, you could say, is that the murder of Emmett Till affected young and old, because he couldn't get it out of his mind, and his father talked about it at night. Younger people, older people. Emmett Till's murder had a huge significance on the civil rights movement and black awareness of what was going on down in the deep south of states like Mississippi. Can you see how you look at a piece of evidence and you make a suggestion and you back it up with a piece of evidence? If you do that in the GCSE exam, ladies and gentlemen, on that question, you have to do 2 inferences. You will get 4 out of 4. And that's a good start for your exam. Don't worry about the exam. I'll do a whole video on that later. But I'm just putting that in now to sort of get us used to the inference question. So there we have the end of the video. That's the end of the first section of the course. The next group of videos, we move to the second section. And it is Protest, Progress and Radicalism, 1960 to 1975. So we've done the 50s. Now we're going to look at what actually it led to in the 1960s and the 1970s. As ever, I hope it's been useful. All the best now. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.